So what in the world is equity crowdfunding and how is it different from crowdfunding? Now, by the time this video is over, you'll be the smartest person in the room on the world of angel investment and this strategy at your next neighborhood cookout. Look, I'm also excited to talk about this brand new world that opened up in 2016 thanks to some legislation. Now, I've actually invested in close to 20 startups and I continue to invest all the time. Look, all of my startups came from the world of equity crowdfunding. So here's some things that we're going to be talking about in this video together today. Now, we're going to talk about the laws that have changed recently, making equity crowdfunding possible. We're going to talk about the difference between crowdfunding and equity crowdfunding. We're going to be talking about some of the places that you can go and find startups and invest in them. We're going to talk about how you can invest, how much you can invest, and then ultimately what's the minimums that you can invest. And lastly, we're going to talk about how much a startup can actually raise in a given year. Plenty to cover, so let's dive in. Let's talk about the legislation that made all of this possible. It's called the Jobs Act. Now, the Jobs Act opened up its doors in 2016 officially, but it started back in 2012 when President Barack Obama signed into law the Jobs Act in the Rose Garden at the White House. It took 4 years to get everybody on the same page, get the legislation worked out, but then in 2016, boom, equity crowdfunding was launched to the public for the very first time ever. Look, before this moment, if you were a non-accredited investor, basically not a rich person, and you wanted to invest in an early stage startup, you could not do that. Well, this legislation in 2016 opened it up and made it possible for everyday investors to jump in and become an equity owner, to own a share of an early stage startup, which is pretty cool. Now, at the beginning, traction was kind of slow to gain, but then it started to really pick up momentum. And then 2020 showed up. People were online, marketing was easier, there was a lot of eyeballs, people really started moving into equity crowdfunding. And then in 2021, some legislation changed that made it possible for startups to go from raising just over $1 million to all the way up to $5 million. Well, this opened up the door for startups that maybe $1 million wasn't enough for them, but some bigger, more well-known, further down the line startups were like, hey, this is now a possibility. I can open up the door to my customers and my members to come be investors in our company, which brings me to our next point. What is the difference between crowdfunding and equity crowdfunding? Well, with crowdfunding, we've heard it for years, Indiegogo or Kickstarter. Basically what you do is you go and you give a certain amount of money, you designate a certain amount of money to a company that has an idea for a thing, right? They want to make an impact, they want to do something, they want to build a product of sorts. So then what happens is you give them some form of cash. And someday you will probably get a product in the mail, hopefully, if all goes well, right? But equity crowdfunding is exactly what it sounds like. You actually get equity in a company. Now, there's various ways that you can invest. Sometimes you get equity right away and you own a share in the company. Sometimes it's a convertible note. It's debt that will convert into equity down the line, or something also known as a safe note. But crowdfunding, you're paying for a product, you don't own a piece of the company. Equity crowdfunding, you're investing in the startup in hopes that one day you'll see a return on your capital. All right. Let's talk about the platforms that are out there right now as we're recording this, where you can go and find startups. And I'll give you a little bit of the nuances and the differences between each one of these portals and platforms. The first one I want to talk about is a company called WeFunder. Now, WeFunder is a B Corp. That means they are committed to doing good as well as making money. Now, their kind of philosophy and their thesis is they kind of open up their doors to anyone who wants to invest. They don't care if you have an idea, if you just started or whatever. They're like, hey, we're going to give everyone an opportunity to go raise money from the crowd. So that's WeFunder. Start Engine is another one of the big names you've seen out there, and maybe you've seen their ads with Kevin O'Leary. Kevin O'Leary is an advisor and an endorser of this portal and platform, and he invests in some of the deals on that platform as well. They're a little more strict on their rules of who can come in. You kind of basically have to be in revenue, be making money before you can list on their portal and platform, which is very similar to kind of another big one that's out there called Republic. Republic's interesting because they have some rules and regulations as well, but they're not as loose as WeFunder is. So they kind of have to vote, and the whole leadership team has to decide which companies can go on there. But still, there's some pretty early stage companies are on there. Now, the thing about Republic is they don't just have startups, they have crypto and the metaverse and real estate. So they have a wider range of industries and sectors that you could actually jump into. Now, there's another portal called Equifund. Now, Equifund's a very different portal and platform. They just do a few deals a year, and they're very selective on the kind of deals that they put on their portals and platforms. So you may see in a given year, they may do 4 or 5 or 6 deals, where WeFunder will do hundreds of deals in a given year, maybe even 1,000, depending on where the numbers land. So those are some of the portals and platforms that are out there. Now, here's some things that I want to make sure you understand and know. See, these platforms, like I said, they do some level of due diligence, but they don't all do the same. So you really need to make sure that you do your own research, because this is a very important note. Make sure you listen to this. You got to remember that a lot of times the companies that are raising on WeFunder, Start Engine, Republic specifically, a lot of those companies, they're building out their own campaign pages. It means they're shooting the video, they're telling the story, they're creating the pitch deck and all the information that you're going to see. So what's happening is they're telling their own story, which is something you just have to be careful of when you're looking at these sites. It doesn't mean that they're bad stories. It's just like, what's somebody going to do? They're going to frame it and say it in a way that makes them look really favorable. Now, I know some of the portals, I believe Republic is one of them, that will look at and review what's said and make sure it lines up with all the financial information and whatnot, because obviously they have to be compliant as well. I know companies like an Equifund, they actually partner with the company to write all the information to make sure that that information is good and clean and compliant. So you just got to be watching that when you're looking at these different deals. All right, let's talk about who can invest in these deals. Anyone who's over 18 years of age. Now, doesn't matter how much money you make, which is cool, right? Now, there are a couple spots in Canada that basically don't allow their residents to invest, but mostly all of the US and really most parts of the world can invest, but you really always got to make sure you check your local laws to make sure it works for you. And one way you can find out is, depending on where you live, if you're around the globe or you're in a certain province in Canada, is go try and invest and tell them your address, and they'll let you know right away if you're allowed to or not. All right, let's talk about accredited versus non-accredited investors. I get this question all the time. So what does it mean to be an accredited investor? Now, there's some certain stipulations and numbers that the government puts out there in the world to kind of deem someone an accredited investor. Now, like I said earlier, before these laws were enacted, accredited investors are the only ones that could actually invest in early stage startups. So here's some of the requirements. You have to have an annual income of $200,000 individually or $300,000 jointly with your spouse, and it has to happen kind of in the last 2 years, making around the same or even a higher income. Another thing that is part of that requirement, or can be something used to kind of validate an accredited status, is you have to have a net worth of over $1 million. Now, this is either individually or jointly with your spouse. Now, this is a thing that people don't really maybe hear sometimes. This is excluding your primary residence, okay? This is excluding. This is $1 million net worth in other things other than your primary residence. Now, recently, when I talked about the new laws that changed, meaning that it increased the value or the amount of money that a startup could raise, well, also there's some other things. So if you have an active certificate with a Series 7, a Series 65, or a Series 82 license, you will also be considered an accredited investor, even if you don't hit those income thresholds or the $1 million in net worth. Okay, so that's what makes you an accredited investor. Let's talk about non-accredited investors. Well, basically, that's anyone that does not meet that criteria. Now, there are some limits that you can invest per calendar year based on your specific net worth, right? So there's some caps. Now, typically each funding portal, they're going to ask you some qualifying questions, where you stand, what your income looks like. And that is going to basically set the limits. They're going to put the caps on it based off of what kind of the regulations that are out there. Now, this is something really important that you have to know. No one's going to verify this information. If you show up on Republic or Start Engine, no one's going to say, hey, can you prove to us that that is your net worth, or that's how much money you make, right? So only you know. Nobody knows your financial situation better than you. So maybe you go and you sign up and your net worth is not worth $100 million, or then something happens, right? And you go, or you make more than the $300,000 a year annually, and you want to go into that portal and platform, you can change your status and say, hey, I'm now worth more than $1 million. I sold a business. I had a big return of money, and now I'm sitting on, or I sold a house and I got massive returns. Whatever it is, I'm now worth more than $1 million. So if that's something that happens and changes in your life, you can go back, update that information, and basically the handcuffs are off and you can invest as much as you want. All right, one of the last things I want to cover is how much you can invest. Typically what happens is the number is set somewhere at a bottom of like a minimum of $100. Now, I've seen some that have $1,000 or $200 or $500. Kind of depends on the startup and what decisions they make, right? And they know their audience, or they know their members will only want to invest at a minimum of 100, or they'll invest at 500. Well, that's it. But again, coming back to you, it's all about what works best for you and your personal situation. Okay, so always make sure you go in with a plan, take your time, and do your research. Now, the last thing I actually want to cover is how much can a startup raise via equity crowdfunding in 1 year? Well, the new legislation that I talked about makes it possible now for you to raise $1.2 million. Now, that's not as big of a hurdle for companies to get into because they just need reviewed financials. Now, if you want to raise all the way up to $5 million in a given year, you have to go get audited financials, which costs you a lot of money. A lot of people dig into your stuff, and ultimately that's going to be posted on your campaign page, and everyone can see where your financials are. And I'm telling you, if you're an investor, you want to make sure you review that audit, look at their financials, and see how good they are with their money. Now, the last thing I want to note is something for you to watch out for. If a founder or a company, like if you're keeping your eye on the different portals and platforms out there, and you see over and over and over again that this company's on this, they're on WeFunder, and then they're on Start Engine, and now they're on Republic, and they're over here, like, that's usually a red flag for me and something that you need to watch, because typically after they get done with like certain rounds, it's probably time to stop getting money from the crowd and go to institutional money. Now, some founders, they're good founders and they believe wholeheartedly in the crowd, and that's the only way they want to raise money. Now, some founders, they take advantage of the system and they never really actually build anything. And that's the part that just makes me furious and something that you have to watch out for. So if you see a founder raising on multiple platforms and portals, go and ask them in the questions. You can ask any founder any question you want on their campaign page. Hey, why have you chose to go all this? And what kind of traction have you gained in your time as you've moved through each one of these portals? And most likely they've probably raised their valuation along the way. Okay, now that is an extremely high overview, fast overview of the world that I know that is called equity crowdfunding. But I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope this has been informative for you. Look, I love this new world of investing, and I think it's going to be another route for everyday investors to build generational wealth. But I also want to say this, it is extremely risky. It's a very risky space. Investing in early stage startups is probably one of the riskiest places you could actually park your money. So do me a favor, when you go look at these different portals and platforms, please make sure you do your research, do your homework, because I want you to feel confident before you step into a deal and before you invest, okay? Now, don't forget, I want you to stay in the loop with all the things that are happening in the world of equity crowdfunding, some of the ventures and journeys I'm on, some of the companies that I'm investing in, right? So to do that, just make sure you subscribe to this channel right here, and you'll be up to date with everything happening in our world. And also, if you haven't heard yet, I am on a mission to represent you as the very first ever non-billionaire as a guest judge on Shark Tank. Look, I want to go and I want to represent the people for the very first time. So if you want to see how I plan to make all of that happen, all you have to do is click right here.